Hello, and welcome to part 3 of our video series that we're doing, Why I Believe, based on the book by Pastor Ingram. Uh, I'm not going to do full recaps of all the previous episodes. There will be a playlist linked at the end of this video, but chapter 2 of Why I Believe by Pastor Chip Ingram uh, kind of continues the thought that he started in chapter 1. So, in chapter 1, we were discussing the importance of the resurrection of Jesus Christ and why it was so important. And Pastor Ingram laid out 7 reasons he believes we have justified reason to believe in the resurrection of Christ. And he gave the first 4 in chapter 1, and then he's going to give the remaining 3 in this chapter. So, in chapter 1, just as the briefest of overviews, please go back and watch part 2, which is chapter 1 of his book. Reason 1 is the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth. Reason 2 was the character of Jesus is unquestioned. Number 3 was the works of Jesus went unchallenged. And number 4, the identity of Jesus was confirmed. So we open chapter 2. Pastor Ingram is going to give us the 3 remaining reasons for having confidence that Christ was resurrected from the dead. And these questions are going to focus on, did Jesus really die? I will say, for me personally, before I get into this, I'm going through this book just like you had bought this book. And I honestly don't know why his book is structured this way. Maybe it will make sense as we go through this book. And me personally, I'm not an author, but if I were, I probably, if I was going to give something like 7 reasons, I wouldn't put 4 in one chapter and 3 in the next. I would probably either put all 7 in one chapter, or I would, if I were doing this as a video series, I would probably do a video on each specific reason and go into more detail than we're going to in this book. And because if you look at my part 2 is an hour and 5 minutes long. It maybe takes 15, 20 minutes to read chapter 1, but I felt that there was a lot of depth that was being missed that could have been covered, and I kind of brought that out because I do agree with Pastor Ingram that the resurrection of Christ is one of the most important things, because if there is no resurrection of Christ, then anything else we would write in a book like this, there's no point to it. So I agree with that we need to be rock solid. So why are we asking the question, did Jesus really die? Well, there are those who have said that Jesus didn't really die and that his death and resurrection were faked by his disciples. Some people, like the author Dan Brown, popularized this in his book, The Da Vinci Code, which speculates that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, but he was rescued from the tomb by his disciples, went on to marry Mary Magdalene, and had a bunch of kids, and the whole book centers on this person who is supposedly a biological descendant of Christ. I do not believe any of that I just said. So, did Jesus really die? Why is the answer to this question so important? Well, if Jesus didn't die, then he couldn't have risen. And if Jesus didn't rise, then Jesus is not God. And if Jesus isn't God, he's a liar and a fake. The point Pastor Ingram makes in the opening of this chapter reminds me of the point made in C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, that at the end of the day, you have to make one of three determinations. Either Jesus is Lord, he's a lunatic, or a liar. There's not really an in between. And the point he's making, he gives an illustration in this chapter talking about his two sons. There was a certain house in their neighborhood that they weren't allowed to go to, especially when the parents weren't home, because the other kids were into watching movies that he felt was inappropriate for his kids, and they were known to drink because there was alcohol in the house. So he forbade his boys from going, and he caught them on a couple occasions coming out of this house. And his whole point in this illustration is, when he questioned his sons about it, he was getting all kinds of excuses and rationale why he was doing what he was doing. But by asking a simple question sometime, like, did Jesus really die? You can cut through the veneer, the stuff that we make up and build up to arbitrarily make things more complicated than they really have to be. So we ask the question, did Jesus really die? So the fifth reason Pastor Ingram gives is he says that the death of Jesus is undisputed. Now, this section of this chapter, though I agree with Pastor Ingram, and he would be my spiritual elder because, he's been to Dallas Theological Seminary and everything, so I'm not trying to disparage him. I agree with his conclusion, but I disagree with the wording of this reasoning, because if the death of Jesus is undisputed, you wouldn't have people going around saying that Jesus didn't really die. You wouldn't have things like the swoon theory that says that Jesus took some herbs and stuff that slowed his heart down enough that people thought he was dead, but he really wasn't dead. Personally, I think Lee Strobel, in his book, The Case for Christ, makes a much stronger case proving that Jesus really died by talking to various medical experts, and goes into a lot more detail. I do have that book, so if you want to, comment below and let me know, would you be interested in me doing kind of a similar thing that I'm doing here on the Case for Christ, based by Lee Strobel? So I believe Jesus really did die. And the reason I believe Jesus really died is not because it's undisputed, it's because of what the Bible tells us. So, and what we know from history. First, we know Romans, they were experts at execution. They did one thing well, and that was kill. That was the whole being of the Roman army, was to kill and conquer. They were excellent at it. Military people today still take inspiration from a lot of the war theory that was developed under the Roman Empire. So, if you don't know, crucifixion is a horrible way to die. How does being on a cross kill you? Well, the way being on a cross kills you, slide back a little. So if you're on a cross, you have your arms. Your arms are either tied or nailed. and your whole body weight is hanging. So what happens is this keeps your diaphragm from being able to move up and down. It stops you from being able to breathe. So what happens if I was not sitting in a chair and I was hanging like, I would get to the point where I can't exhale carbon dioxide that's building up in my body, and take maybe some shallow breaths. But to really get a good breath, my feet, I would have to use my feet and push up. And this is hurting me the whole time I'm doing this. I would have to push up with my feet, try to catch my breath. And then when I can't take the pain anymore from pushing myself up, fall back down until I can't take that anymore. And crucifixions would last sometimes days before the person being crucified would die. And if they wanted to speed up an execution, uh, like they did in the case of Jesus, uh, they would go through and break the legs. And the way breaking the legs killed you is it kept you from being able to push yourself up. So eventually you would suffocate. So, you know, let's look at this scripture. So, uh, uh, so John chapter 19 verses 31 through 34. And this is the ESV version. Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, that they may be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. So, medical experts looking at the crucifixion, looking at the scourging he endured before the crucifixion, you know, Christ had so much blood loss, he actually died very quickly on the cross. And uh, this whole thing about sticking the spear in the side, this is not just a little poke with a spear and some blood comes out. I've heard people, and I've even heard sermons where people say, Jesus died of a broken heart and his heart turned to water. Well, I'm sure his heart was broken, but medically speaking, and any of you that's listening have a medical background, feel free to fact check me on. But if you don't know, inside your chest, so your heart is a little offset of your heart's a muscle, but it sits in what's called the pericardial sac. It's a sac of fluid that your heart, it helps protect your heart from getting banged around. Because if your heart was just hanging in your body, attached to the aortas and your aorta and your vena cava and all those big vessels going into the heart, if it was just hung there like big lump of thing, you know, if you got knocked around too much, you would be bruising the actual heart muscle, because it would be bouncing around in your chest. It would be bouncing on the rib cage. So have this sac of fluid that your heart sits in. It protects the heart, but it also gives the heart enough freedom to do its work of pumping your blood. If you've ever known anybody that has congestive heart failure, What congestive heart failure is an infection in the pericardial fluid that causes the pressure of the fluid to build up so much that your heart has a hard time pumping because the fluid it's too pressurized. So it's having a hard time pumping the fluid. So what the Romans would do to verify someone was dead. This is not they held their hand over his nose, I don't feel breath, they didn't take his pulse. They took a spear. They would have come up under his ribs. I think it's always like around the fifth rib that they would shoot for. And they would drive that spear at an angle where it would go in his chest, which would probably also puncture his left lung. So, and then when they pull out the spear, what comes out? Water and blood. Pericardial fluid is typically clear, like water. So, for it to be described as water and blood is further confirmation that he was dead. If he wasn't dead before the spear definitely would have finished him. If he had somehow just been if he had just been completely knocked out, you know. And like I said, the medical experts, and like I said, I'm taking a lot of this from my memory of reading Lee Strobel's book years ago. The medical experts, the scourging, he was scourged before he was crucified. Typically, you either got scourged or crucified. Didn't typically get both. I think Pilate was thinking if he scourged him, that would be enough to get the Jewish leaders off his back, but they weren't happy with that. They still wanted him crucified. And so he was beaten. And when they beat you with a whip that had these balls on the end. And so when they hit you, you had all these balls hit you, and then in the leather straps that those balls were attached to, and it was it was a cat of nine tails, I think is what they called it. It was 9 balls. So you'd have, like, imagine 9 lead balls at the end of 9 leather straps, and inside this leather strap would be pieces of bone and metal and stuff. So when you hit the person, this isn't like getting spanking with a belt. When they pull back, it rips the flesh, opens up everything. And they typically maxed out scourgings to 39 lashes. Because if you do 40, almost nobody could survive 40, which means being scourged 39 times. If Christ hadn't been crucified, if he had not received some type of medical attention, even for those days, he probably would have died anyway from just the blood loss and the dehydration and everything else, that the exhaustion that he had gone through. Not to mention, we're told that the guards, they were mocking him. They were beating him with a rod in the head. He probably had concussions. He was so exhausted he couldn't carry his own cross. I don't have access to one, but if someone out there has access to a railroad tie, imagine taking a railroad tie and carrying it up a hill. And that's probably hard enough to do if you've had nothing. I mean, Jesus was a remarkable specimen of human being, that he was even able to do as much as he did. In fact, I believe that the Bible describes Christ as laying down his life. I believe because he was he was all man, but he was also all God. There was something that he had to willingly lay down his life. It doesn't mean necessarily just going to the cross, that he had to give up the ghost. He had to release uh, his himself from his flesh for a time. So, um, and so I agree that there is no doubt in my mind that Jesus died. In fact, when we get to the burial, take myself off screen because of the title here. When we get to the burial of Jesus, it was public and secured. So let's look at Matthew chapter 27, verses 62 through 66. And then we'll pause there. So the next day, that is the day after the day of preparation, the chief priest and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, remember how that impostor said while he was still alive, 'After 3 days I will rise'? Therefore, order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people he risen from the dead. And the last fraud will be worse than the first." And Pilate said to them, "You have a guard of soldiers. Go, make it as secure as you can." So they went, made the tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard. So let's pause here before I go into it. So if there was any doubt that Christ was actually dead, why are we making all this? None of the people in this biblical account doubt that he's actually dead at this point. Now, what's their chief concern? Well, he said he was going to be risen in 3 days, and we're worried these disciples are going to come and steal his body away so that they can perpetuate a hoax on folks. So, so let's think about this. They were so worried that they had a small contingent of Roman soldiers, and they sealed the tomb. Putting it in today's language, we don't usually use seals. What they're talking about, this would be like crime scene tape. So imagine, if you would, if they had it back in the day, them having crime scene tape over the stone and it's fixed. So if the seal's broken, it will be clear that the seal was broken. Now let's look at what happens just a little while after. So Jesus rises, and then we get to Matthew 28, verses 11 through 15. And it says, "While they were going, behold, some of the guards went into the city and told the chief priest all that had taken place." So the guards saw stone roll away. They were concerned. "And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, 'Tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if it comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him, keep you out of trouble.' So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story has been spread among the Jews to this day." So that's Matthew's kind of notation there that this was still being said when this gospel was written. So when the resurrection took place, what did the chief priests have to do? They paid off the soldiers to say they fell asleep. And they had to give the soldiers assurance that, hey, if this rumor gets around that Roman soldiers fell asleep guarding a tomb and the governor's looking to execute you, because that's the penalty for falling asleep on watch, don't worry, we got you covered. We got your back. We'll tell the governor, no. So you know, it, it this is, you know, this is the situation. Like, what interest would Rome have in helping the Jews perpetuate the hoax? If you look at Pilate interrogating Christ, and because of the dream his wife had had, Pilate didn't want to have anything to do with this. As far as Rome was concerned, this was an internal Jewish struggle. And he was trying to stay as much out of it as he possibly could. And you see it. It's like, okay, whatever. You think this guy is going to rise from the, okay, yeah, here's some soldiers. Take them, do whatever you got to do to secure the tomb. Also, keep in mind, these are Roman soldiers. Um, these a Roman soldier versus a bunch of Galilean guys, most of them fishermen. They're not skilled in war. So, what we're to believe that Jesus, Jesus's disciples went in and got the body, and they didn't wake up. There wasn't a fight. There's not a few dead disciples laying around because, you know, I mean, it's a whole thing. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So, so let's talk about this. So the seventh reason, and he gives, Pastor Ingram, that is, gives a bunch of points, but he says the evidence for the death and resurrection is convincing and reasonable. And I agree with that. But rather than going point by point, let's discuss this. So, first question, if Jesus didn't die, why did the Romans take him off the cross? What benefit would there have been to Rome for them to take someone they weren't sure was absolutely dead? And why would they not bother breaking his legs? Because that's normally how you do it. They actually sticking the spear in was instead of breaking the legs. They were like, he's dead. And even though it doesn't say it like this, I can almost imagine someone, you know, standing around like, y'all need to make sure he's dead. Okay. And basically stabs him through the side up into the heart. If the disciples stole the body, how did they move a stone and sneak out without waking up any of the troops? I've been to Israel. I've seen the types of tombs. You've got a tomb that you go to called the Garden Tomb. May or may not be where Jesus was actually laid. They make a case that that's where he was laid. But when I was in Israel, our tour guide pointed out other similar tombs that had these big stones that had to be rolled uh, rolled away. And so, you know, if you're not familiar, in Jewish customs back then, and even still today, they would bury you in this tomb. Your flesh and stuff would decay, and then your bones would be retrieved and put in a special box. I think it's called an ossuary. I think I've got that term right. So, like, if you see pictures of the Mount of Olives, there's a huge Jewish graveyard, and you'll see all these box areas, and people who come by and visit them put rocks on top of them. But and so they still do it to this day, especially among the most faithful Jews. But we're to believe if so, Jesus died, but the body got stolen. And how did the troops see him or how did the troops know if they were asleep that it was the disciples that stole the body? Then why would Rome allow the lie of the resurrection to involve them failing to properly secure a tomb. You know, the Judea was kind of a pain point for the Roman Empire. There was, the from a Roman perspective, the Jewish people just seemed to refuse to like realize that Rome was in charge now and just go along with the flow. They had all these special religious things, these special festivals. They went through governors left and right. They were constantly having political struggles back and forth between the Sanhedrin, the Roman governors. So, what benefit would Rome have, the Roman governor have, to allow this lie of the resurrection to involve them failing to properly secure tomb? I mean, we're not talking about guarding a prisoner, that not in the normal sense. Jesus was able to come out of his tomb, and he came out of his tomb on his own power. But if you want to look at it from a secular standpoint, it's one thing to have a prison escape, to have a tomb escape. And again, in Acts, when they're in the upper room, there's like 120 disciples. I don't know how many soldiers were here, but there should be, if disciples came in and they weren't asleep, there should be some dead people. Either they were maybe it was only 2 or 3 guards and they were overwhelmed by 100 guys, and there should be some dead Roman soldiers, which that would have really stirred up a whole bunch. Or there should be several dead disciples, around the area of the tomb. But none of that happened. And notice, we go back here. Notice what the chief priest said, and said, "Tell the people his disciples came by night and stole him away while they were asleep." So he's telling the soldiers, if someone says anything to you, you tell them, the common people, that his disciples took it. Because what's the next thing? "And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him, keep you out of trouble." In other words, if Pilate hears that you guys fell asleep and he gets mad about that, don't worry, we'll have you back. We'll explain things to Pilate. So, Rome wasn't really involved in this. This is all a manufacturing of Jewish chief priests that they're trying to get this stirred up. Because, and here's another thing, and that's not a discussion, if Christ wasn't risen, why make up this elaborate story about his body being stolen? Because the tomb was empty. What benefit would the disciples have for perpetuating a hoax like the resurrection? When you read the rest of the New Testament, what benefit is it to the disciples to keep this hoax going, if it were a hoax, as skeptics would say? The Jews don't like you. Romans don't like you. You're not getting rich off this. These guys, in fact, Paul, when he was Saul of Tarsus, after he became an apostle, when you read in 2 Timothy, it sounds like Paul went to probably being fairly wealthy and well off, to not to begging Timothy to send a coat to him, you know, to nothing. So there was no financial gain. You know, usually when you perpetuate a hoax, you have something you are hoping to gain out of it. So where's the gain? All the disciples who became apostles, all except for John, died by martyrdom, and they died horrible deaths, history tells. Not to mention all the early Christians, and got people who weren't even necessarily apostles or disciples. You've got Deacon Stephen being stoned. What benefit was it? Nobody personally benefited by keeping this resurrection going if it were a lie. Which I mentioned Saul of Tarsus already. If Christ didn't rise, how does someone, Saul of Tarsus, go from hunter of Christians to one of Christianity's greatest apostles? What happened in his life to make that switch? And you can't say watching Stephen get stoned, because he saw Stephen get stoned and he's on his way to Damascus to go after more. He didn't just have a change of heart, and it's such a 180 change. This would be like taking the book, he says this would be like taking the head of North Korea, and he comes on the news tomorrow and says he realizes how wrong he's been and he's all for human rights. You know, that makes no sense. How did the disciples start a movement that's lasted nearly 2,000 years if the resurrection never happened? It wasn't just the disciples that died. For the first 200 to 300 years of the church, if you were a Christian, somebody was probably trying to kill you. Either Jewish people in the early days or the Romans, because they had a polytheistic culture. You had to worship their gods. And we use a lot of Bible so far in this study. And his next chapter is going to be why I believe the Bible. And hopefully he'll address some of this. And I addressed it in my last video. But we're assuming the Bible is right in a lot of this stuff. And I believe it is right. But for those who are skeptics of the biblical narrative, if the biblical account was a fabricated lie, why would women be the first eyewitnesses mentioned in it? If you were going to make up, and if the scriptures, let's say Matthew, when he's writing his scriptures, Luke, when they're writing, why wouldn't they have Peter or John or one of the apostles be the first ones to see it? No, they made it the women, because this is not cool nowadays. It wasn't necessarily cool back then, but the truth is, women back in those days, if you went to court and you had a whole bunch of women testify something, their testimony could be contradicted by a counter testimony of just one man who could be making the whole thing. So women were much more easily dismissed. So, where are my final thoughts? So, I agree with a lot of what Pastor Ingram has presented, or a lot of the conclusions he draws. I do feel that his cases, and maybe it's just because I'm not the right audience for this material. Maybe he's writing, but I will say my wife and I were discussing this book because we're both reading this for our Wednesday night Bible study. Um, I I am concerned that this book doesn't really give enough that if you were diehard skeptical against Christianity, I haven't seen anything yet that I feel like would really sway my opinion. If Richard Dawkins picked up this book, uh, this would not, this book, I haven't seen a case presented. Uh, Someone like Richard Dawkins would just would keep coming after. This wouldn't change how he's thinking anyway. And like I said in my last video, the truth is, someone with diehard worldview that God doesn't exist or the Bible is a lie, if you can't get on some common ground, you're not going to make headway anyway. So, but my final thoughts, and he makes this, Pastor Ingram makes this point in the book. Yeah, if you were in a jury and you were deliberating on a case whether Christ really died and raised, what evidence would you need to question the biblical narrative? If you look at what the Bible says, just what it says, even if you take out any supernatural aspects, um, you know, what reason do you have to doubt Christ died, was resurrected, based just on what Scripture said? And then when you look at how people behaved, you don't have much to go on. So remember, the reason we're doing this study is 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. You need to always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks a reason for the hope that we have. I said last time, in real life, you're not going to have the 42 minutes I've taken up to this point to answer these questions. So I like to include here at the end how I would kind of sum this up really quickly. If someone said to me, Jesus didn't really die, throw the swoon theory at me, something like that, my simple response would be, then why were they so worried about the body being stolen that they put a guard on it? Or what reason would the Romans have to take him down if he wasn't dead? Why would they care? He was already up on the cross. They could have left him up there for another several days. Why didn't they break his legs? That's how they typically did it. When they ran the spear through his side, and from the description given in the Bible, they pierced all the way to his heart. If the cross didn't kill him, that would have killed him. So I find it hard to believe that Jesus didn't die. If someone challenged me on the fact that the disciples stole the body, to create that they were perpetuating a hoax, my response would be, if this is a hoax, where's the benefit? I've already covered this, but with all the horrible ways they died, none of them gained any money from it. To what end was this hoax perpetrated on? So let me know what you think. Please subscribe if you want to get updates on when these videos come out. But hopefully, as we go through this book, some of these other things will make sense. I'm hoping the next chapter, like I said, I'm going through it just like you would. So I haven't read ahead other than to see what the chapters are. So I'm hoping we're going to talk a little bit more about the Bible and, why I believe that we can rely on what the Bible says. I believe there's enough evidence to prove that. And hopefully that's what we'll look at next time. So until then, have a great day.